majestic. It's the only time that word appears in the notes, but it is a central quality of what these men were about. As well as scholarly rigour and all that Puritan clarity, they also need this kingly grandeur, a royal music, a greatness overarching the whole translation. For me, this sense of majesty is one of the reasons for the lasting appeal of the King James Bible. The language is dense with a kind of verbal sumptuousness which flows effortlessly from the translators, and I think that's in large part down to the period in which they lived. This is Hatfield House in Hertfordshire. It was completed in the same year the Bible was published, 1611, for James's Secretary of State, Robert Cecil. Its furnishings are rich and lavish, just like the King James Bible. But they're illuminated by the pure, clear light of the windows, a fusion of old and new, which is typical of the age.
The Great Hall is a very, very ancient type of interior. In the early 17th century, it's more than 1,000 years old in grand English domestic buildings. But it's covered with this thick cosmetic cream of highly fashionable ornament. So you have here these two elements of the Jacobin world, the antique and the antic, as classical, juxtaposed to each other.
So what is it? If you look at one of these screens, what do you get? I mean, when I look at it, I get huge substance, sort of fatness, a great dense bit of stuff.
Yes, exactly. It's covered in ornament. It's a huge piece of furniture rising up, nearly 40 feet in the air, and covered in fine decorative ornament.
Well, it's not exactly fine. It looks absolutely chunky to me. It's not, it's not 18th century Chippendale delicacy, is it? It's socking great bearded hermaphrodites.
Yeah, well, it's a very medieval kind of classicism, in the sense it's taking classical forms and ornamenting them as fantasy. This is delighting, basically, in the opulence of the possibilities of ornament, covering every surface in carving, making everything as fussy as possible.
But are they kind of engaging with all this medievalism because they think that somehow value is in the old?
They do see value in the old. It's a very interesting question that. We see value in novelty and we pursue it. They love novelty too, but they saw novelty as being tempered by the past, and they often reinvented the past and created novelty through that reinvention.
The language of Hatfield is the language of the King James Bible. And nowhere is that sensibility better displayed than in the first edition of the finished work. It's incredibly exciting for me to see this. I've never seen it before. It's an amazingly rich thing. I don't think I've ever seen such a rich 17th century binding as this, covered all over in this gold filigree with Cecil's arms there. No title on the spine at all, just more of that decoration. This is the book.
And its sheer size and ornament shows that this is a really important object.
Well, even in the way it's produced, you can see this love of antiquity. This Gothic typeface is saying, I am rooting myself in the authority of the past.
It's a little bit like the Great Hall, isn't it? So you have the Great Hall as this antique element, the essential element of a great house being reproduced, but covered in other decoration and made to look up to date in other ways.
Now, if we turn to particular passages, I think you can see how some of these qualities come through in the way they translated the text itself. Now, this is a famous verse. When Tyndale translated that passage, he wrote, "Now we see in a glass, even in a dark speaking, but then shall we see face to face." Well, it's very difficult to know what that means, but when the King James people took it up, then they wrote, "For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face." Much simpler, much grander, much more godly, in fact.
It's beautifully clear language, isn't it?
It's clear, but it also has this slow, majestic music running through it. And I think something of the things that we see in this house, a kind of displayed grandeur, an absolutely overt, majestic quality to the spaces, that's in that language too.
This is a very nice idea that somehow the house expresses the same ideals, celebrating its royalty, regality, power, and also at the heart of it, the link of the church and state, the godliness that this Bible expresses.
In tracing the story of how the King James Bible was made, I have discovered many of the reasons why it became such a success. The precision and rigour of its scholarship, the richness and depth of meaning in its words, the sheer music it brings to the listener's ear. But these achievements alone do not explain why, for over 4 centuries, English speakers have continued to choose this translation above all others. What is it about this version that has such a long-lasting appeal? Conveying the mystery of the divine is the greatest of all challenges to language of any kind. The unfathomable nature of God and of the ultimate facts of existence are, by definition, unreachable. So when life deals its heaviest blows, where do you turn? Not long ago, I was talking to a fisherman whose son had died here off the coast of the Outer Hebrides. He was just 24. His father told me to read Psalm 77, saying in effect that I would find there everything he could ever think or feel about what had happened. Will the Lord cast off forever, and will he be favourable no more? Is his mercy clean gone forever? Doth his promise fail forevermore? Thy way is in the sea, and thy path in the great waters, and thy footsteps are not known. These words aren't about consolation or the muffling of experience by religion. They're a statement of the cruelty of life and the unknowable purpose of God's universe. There is something miraculous about this. A poem written in the Near East in the Bronze Age, translated in England 400 years ago, still embodying some of the deepest and most powerful meanings that human beings can summon. But did the 17th century world recognize this as a masterpiece? And more importantly for James, did it secure his ultimate ambition, to be king at the heart of one united country? There must have been high hopes for the King James Bible when it was finally published in 1611. But it turned out to be a spectacular failure. The actual printing of the Bible was something of a disaster. Numerous inaccuracies crept into the text at this stage. This is a page from an edition published in 1631, which was called the Wicked Bible, because the printer left out rather a crucial word from the 7th commandment, and it now reads, "Thou shalt commit adultery." More significant was the Bible's total failure to achieve James's ambition of uniting the two sides of England's religious divide. 30 years after it was published, the country descended into outright civil war. Puritan and parliamentarian against bishop and king. James's son, Charles I, was beheaded. England became a republic with no place for a royal Bible. It was left gathering dust. So the question is, why did its fortunes change? Today, in most Anglican churches, such as St Margaret's, the parish church of the Houses of Parliament, you will find the King James Bible. At the end of the Civil War, and with the restoration of the monarchy, everything changed.
The King James Bible became revered as something from before that age of violence and trauma. It stood for monarchy and continuity, a symbol of a kingdom that had always been God's country.
It was this that finally allowed it to unite everyone, from radical Protestant to those in love with ceremony. It set the basis for today's Church of England. What's more, it entered the consciousness of the nation. Week after week, decade after decade, for century after century, this book was read in church, at school, at home. Its down-to-earth vocabulary fed our love of the real and the concrete. And the way in which it was written meant its listeners were always at home with the grand and the visionary. For me, the ability to keep both feet firmly on the ground while aspiring for something beyond ourselves represents the best of us as a nation. And I would say that long exposure to the language of the King James Bible is responsible for much of that. But what of James himself? What would he have made of his great legacy?
For a king who thought of himself as sparkling with divinity, this is a pretty modest little plaque. But maybe James could console himself with the idea that the Bible he commissioned is his real and lasting monument. It became the most important book in the English-speaking world, perhaps the greatest book ever written in English.
I'm no churchgoer, but I'm not an atheist either. I'm drawn just as much to all the richness of ceremony as to the holiness of the plain and simple. But with this Bible, there's no need to choose between them. Both are absorbed in it, and that is why its words are still alive, why they're still a vehicle for meaning when little else can be. And for me, that is the miracle of the King James Bible.
Coming up this evening, Books on the BBC continues with a celebration of half a century of a groundbreaking novel. Andrew Smith heads to Alabama next to mark 50 years of To Kill a Mockingbird.